The first episode of House of the Dragon demonstrates just how similar the new series is to Game of Thrones. The George R.R. Martin fantasy novel series A Song of Ice and Fire was the inspiration for the original HBO series Game of Thrones, which established the live-action branch of the franchise. Following the death of the previous king, Westeros saw internal strife and backstabbing as numerous houses battled to stake their claim to the Iron Throne. Daenerys Targaryen, commonly known as the Mother of Dragons, was a pivotal figure in the series and was thought to be the last survivor of the legendary House Targaryen. In Episode 1, Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen tries to find her place within the court of King Viserys. The words of House Targaryen are fire and blood, and this Game of Thrones prequel about the silver-haired royals who controlled Westeros for decades, triumphed in numerous wars, and frequently wed one another, ought to deliver on that promise. The series features blood and violent graphic blasts and splatters. However, summoning fire is more difficult. That is true both physically and metaphorically, since House of the Dragon lacks continuous time with the titular beasts, whose presence in Game of Thrones was so exhilarating and imaginative, undermining character development and dampening any sparks made by its ensemble. One of the very moving sequences in the series is Drogon grieving Dany's death. The dragons in this place don't only lack distinct personalities or feel less physically palpable than they did previously, this is an issue. It's because House of the Dragon disregards them just as it disregards our focus. House of the Dragon, which is based on George R.R. Martin's Fire and Blood, begins with a questionable disadvantage. Game of Thrones last season alienated audiences with its increasingly illogical plotting, underwhelming resolutions for many heroes and villains, and the idea that Bran Stark, who had been converted into some sort of magical monitoring program, won the Iron Throne. But before that, there were legitimate complaints about the way that the show frequently othered persons of color in Dorne, Essos, and the Dothraki Sea, as well as its dependence on sexposition and rape as a character-building tactic. Given all of that, the first 6 episodes of House of the Dragon, which were sent to critics for review, exude a palpable wariness, as if the show's creators, Ryan J. Condal and Miguel Sapochnik, are trying their best to prevent complaints of a similar nature. In response to criticism that Game of Thrones female characters gradually lost their interiority, House of the Dragon presents 2 teenage protagonists that the first season follows for around 15 years. Writers make a vow to reduce sexual assault in response to complaints about its pervasiveness. The casting is more diverse, especially for House Velaryon, an ancient Valyrian house that, though lacking in dragons, is comparable to House Targaryen in terms of riches, status, and power. All of these choices seem like sound first steps, but House of the Dragon falters when it comes to creating its own inner world, characters, and connections. The same type of soft power sniping that Sansa, Margaery, and Cersei did before them traps those young women in it, or, technically, after them. The series supports the awful perspective on labor and delivery that replaces rape with the words, spoken by a mother to a daughter, "The childbed is our battlefield," by limiting female characters to their anatomy. The show takes a Bridgerton-like approach to racial diversity, with black members of House Velaryon and other people of color in its armies, but then doesn't dive into how that ethnic difference might be viewed throughout Westeros. Pirate baddies still get the Orientalist treatment, though, and are dressed quite a bit like Ottomans. Those are all components of a larger prevailing shortcoming that hovers over House of the Dragon through various time jumps and recastings. It defines itself in relation to Game of Thrones as a prequel, but is indecisive about to what degree it should be a copy versus an evolution. The series assumes its viewers have a certain amount of familiarity with marriage's political capital, how chaos is a ladder, and the meanings of A Song of Ice and Fire and Dracarys, and assures those same viewers that they can still enjoy watching those things because House of the Dragon is more woman-focused and somewhat less lurid. But the series seems so stuck on what it doesn't want to be that no part of it feels fully defined on its own terms. An opening intertitle informs that House of the Dragon begins 172 years before the birth of Daenerys Targaryen, immediately tipping off that this series keeps non-Game of Thrones watchers at a distance. The 7 kingdoms are ruled by King Viserys I Targaryen, Paddy Considine, who, as the oldest male descendant of the previous king, was chosen as ruler over a woman with a stronger claim, his cousin Princess Rhaenys, Eve Best. A succession council thought the realm wasn't ready for a female ruler, and the series returns to this misogynistic tension over and over again, without illuminating anything new about the fact that, yes, patriarchy bad. 9 years into Viserys' rule, Rhaenys' understandable resentment over being denied the Iron Throne casts a shadow over the alliance between Viserys, Rhaenys, and her devoted husband, Lord Corlys Velaryon, Steve Toussaint. The king has a better relationship with his hand, Sir Otto Hightower, Rhys Ifans, whose 15-year-old daughter, Alicent, Emily Carey, is close friends with Viserys' same-age daughter, Princess Rhaenyra, Millie Alcock. Otto, though, hates Viserys' younger brother, Prince Daemon, Matt Smith, a wildcard whose impetuousness and open desire for power have made him few friends at court. There's a lot of that kind of thing introduced in the early episodes. Houses that don't get along, siblings who feel passed over, knights questioning one another's honor. But those sentiments are blandly written and even more rigidly delivered by an ensemble that is so far solid but lacking the kind of nuanced material that helped Peter Dinklage turn Tyrion Lannister into such a mercurial figure or Emilia Clarke into the infamous Mother of Dragons. Instead, this extraneous plotting suppresses what should be one of House of the Dragon's main priorities: building out who these characters are internally rather than how they present externally. Rhaenyra and Alicent suffer most from the series' use of them as chess pieces rather than people, moving them closer or further away from the crown to amplify narrative tension. But what do either of them actually anticipate or envision for their futures? How do they spend their days? If they are meant to be best friends, as the pilot suggests, what memories or experiences have they shared, and what about that closeness fulfills or irritates them? Despite being House of the Dragon's attempt to show that this franchise is about women now, Rhaenyra and Alicent each have major gaps in their characterization, and that patchiness makes everything from who they fall in love with to how they perceive each other either perfunctory or puzzling. Alcock gives young Rhaenyra flinty gumption as she fights to remain Viserys' heir and convince the realm that she can be queen, but the season's 4th and 5th episodes saddle the character with goofy choices that not even her liveliness can make believable. Older versions of Rhaenyra and Alicent, played by Emma Darcy and Olivia Cooke, respectively, have a little more to work with as their worlds get bigger and they wield more influence within King's Landing. But the series' leaps forward in time are ultimately a hindrance, not an asset. Too much progression is alluded to rather than depicted, and years of war, marriage, and parenthood are shunted off-screen in a way that keeps these characters as thin ciphers. Early on in Game of Thrones, before the show collapsed under its own self-seriousness and truculent shock value, it was easy to pick favorites to love or hate. That's not just because the Starks were so principled and just, and the Lannisters so smug and corrupt, but because the series took its time building the layered relationships between families, allies, and enemies, and framing their decision-making through house words and ideologies. The show traveled around the fictional continent, making disparate locations like the Wall, Harrenhal, and the Iron Islands feel tangible and real. But even if you weren't to compare House of the Dragon to those immersive early days of Game of Thrones, the former feels limited both visually, with its nondescript CGI exteriors, and narratively, in particular, by its refusal to slow its pace. A foe who could have been a way for the series to explore Westerosi geography and deepen its central players is disposed of rapidly and anticlimactically. An affair between one of the main characters and a Kingsguard knight materializes and vaporizes in barely 45 minutes of screen time. Daemon seesaws so often between misunderstood bad boy and legitimate asshole that it's impossible to keep track of what Smith is attempting to achieve with all his smirking. House of the Dragon moves like it's trying to outrun a fireball, but without texture and finesse. The series is just small council meetings full of arguing old men, an irritating amount of Targaryen on Targaryen flirting, and increasingly gruesome childbirth. The series' opening text warns that the only thing that could tear down the House of the Dragon was itself, and whether unintentionally or subconsciously, it's right.